So first up, we're going to talk about the 300 Xc Tpi bike for 2020. Like I said, this is kind of, depending upon how you look at it, it's sort of a new model for KTM. Basically, they've had a 300 Xc and also a 250 Xc, which we'll talk about later. In the United States, Xc, of course, is the cross-country signification. So this is an off-road bike that is a little more, per their tagline, ready to race. It's a little bit more aggressive than the EXC line. But this is the first time they've had TPI in this lineup. They originally debuted the TPI bikes in the EXC style model in the US. And we initially, I believe, only had the 250 the first year. Then we've ended up getting both the 250 and 300. So then bringing it to the XC model is actually quite a few changes. The XC runs on a different platform, chassis, swing arm, and suspension-wise than the EXC. The EXC has their Explorer fork. It's an older style open bath fork, pretty basic. Not a lot of damping characteristics or total damping force can be created from that fork. It's very soft. It's a subtle fork, meant more for trail riding, light enduro work. And then the shock, like I said, is a PDS system on the EXC. Coming over to this XC bike, we're basically getting the same chassis you would normally find for the SX bikes, albeit it is still a little bit tweaked from there. You're getting that swing arm, and you're getting a linkage for this bike. So you're getting the shock design that we see on their motocross models, and you're also getting the AER 48 air fork that we find from the motocross bike. KTM runs this fork on all of their XC models, whether it's 2-stroke or 4-stroke. It's definitely a higher end fork for them. The size of the components inside are bigger. Your damping rod, your damping piston, basically all that stuff is a lot bigger. It has the ability to produce more damping force overall. So definitely a step up of what you can do and how much you can tune that suspension. And like I said, we're on to actually having a linkage instead of a PDS system from the XC. The engine itself is going to be a bit more aggressive in this trim. It's not going to have as wide. It's going to have a little bit tighter transmission ratio than what we see on the EXC. And then from there, it's also just going to be overall tuned a bit different from compression ratio. The mapping itself is going to be the biggest thing, and the exhaust system. So I'm kind of glad they've waited this long, per se, to start to expand the range of the TPI, because I went to the first TPI launch, not for KTM because they did theirs at Eresburg. I went to the Husqvarna one, which was in Canada. And while the bike was really enjoyable to ride, both the 250 and 300 felt very underpowered. We were at a bit of altitude, but still, even with that, they just felt like the 300 felt like a 250 and the 250 felt like a 200. And they were extremely mellow off the bomb, which I understand, yes, enduro bike is supposed to be easy ride, but there was no real two-stroke characteristic to it. It actually made it kind of hard to ride them in rocks. Actually, little stuff that, I wanted the style and feel of two-stroke. It didn't have it. And they definitely listened, because they didn't really update anything mechanically about those bikes as much as they changed all the mapping, being that it was kind of a new system to have transfer port injection, where you basically have a fuel style injected throttle body that feeds in, and then the oil is injected directly in the transfer ports. All that brings a new area into the mapping, because you're dealing with how much fuel is being sprayed in, and then how much oil is being sprayed in later and being injected into the system. And the version I rode last year basically told me was mechanically the same, but it was drastically different. It was just a map update. And actually, if you own one of them, you can take it down to your dealer and they can update you to the latest map. They've changed it a few times since the bike has been released. And at that point, the bikes felt way more what their displacement was. They had still very smooth and usable power characteristic, but much more two-stroke like. And just, it was an overall huge improvement. So now they've learned a lot about that. They're taking that next step with this product by bringing it into the XC range. I know some people probably thought they would bring it into SX this year, but they're not. This is kind of that in-between step that we'll probably see before they get to SX. Based on what I had ridden, I don't think it would have made, even with the update, it still needs a bit more work before I think it can match or be comparable to what the SX power output and feel actually is. So like I said, this is a step for them. So basically, we're taking that EXC motor, putting in the XC chassis, or overall version of that bike. We're changing gear or transmission ratios, compression ratio, etc. We've got different suspension on the bike. Big one for this bike, it says overall, is a couple of updates. Of course, the graphics, the TPI inclusion, ambient air pressure sensor for improved altitude compensation. So I think that's an update over even the previous TPI technology systems. Interesting one is the exhaust system. I think a few people may have seen photos popping of this, but they've got, it looks kind of like a ribbed overall pipe system, and it's basically like a built-in guard system that they have done. They've basically done, it's called a corrugated surface, which is built onto the expansion chamber. So the overall design of the exhaust system is specific for this platform to improve performance, but also the design of it is for more durable construction. So you basically don't, you don't have to go all the way of putting a big bulky pipe guard on it right out of the box if you're going to ride some really tighter enduro in the rocks areas where you think you're going to crush it, smash it into things. Other than that, like I said, the bike pretty much takes over everything else traditionally from the Xc lineup. So it's got the same chassis and bodywork and overall look as the 2019 Xc models. Are just left out. It's really the inclusion of the TPI that makes it different. So nothing else really to talk about there with the 300. Moving over to the 250, we're dealing with basically the exact same list of updates to the bike per se, being that all the 300 is a bored out version of the 250. We're dealing with the same stroke, same cases, same counterbalancer, etc., etc. It's a TPI update to the existing 250 Xc model, so we're basically getting the 2019 Xc chassis, linkage, all the body work, because the 250 was also only available as an EXC before, so we're dealing with a different transmission ratio. Basically, I'm basically repeating myself. It's take everything I just said from the 300, bring it over to the 250. Suspension, graphics, ambient air pressure sensor, the exhaust system, albeit exact for the 250, is also got the corrugated surface. Basically, that's exactly what you're getting. It's down to the choice of which power style do you want. The bikes are listed as the exact same weight. Large piston, the 300 is actually probably only 0.1 pound heavier. They come in at 223.3 pounds dry without fuel. Honestly, it is pretty cool to see these bikes because, albeit some guys probably look at the TPI and them dropping carbureted models for TPI, might get a little worried because of the simplicity of a carbureted bike per se to work on it. At least in the EXCs, I was a big fan of the idea of riding one over the fact of like long distance style riding. I love the idea of being able to go out with buddies on 500s, 450s, 350s, whatever, on a long style ride and just being able to stop at a gas station and fill up. I mean, the fact that you now carry your own oil volume on the bike and enough, depending upon your style riding, speed, how much oil it's injecting, to use up to 5, 6, even 7 full tanks of fuel before you've gone through all your oil. So kind of adds a little bit of an area there. If you haven't ridden TPI, they're also really interesting for me in tight situations, a lot of descending, because the bike doesn't really seem to gum up that it really doesn't. If you've been descending for a while, on say carbureted ones, you're always kind of blipping, trying to keep the bike up and burning. Otherwise, after you've just creeped and crawled down something, get to the bottom, it takes a while to clean the bike back out. The TPI basically is just quick and responsive. The moment you crawl down off of something, you get out on a little fire road or something, you open up the bike, it's right there. It's crisp. It's already cleaned out. It's running just like it should. And then I think the big reason they took us, of course, for the Husky event up to a ski resort basically was to be able to change altitude at a pretty extreme rate, both ascending and descending, by measurements of 4,000 and 5,000 feet, which made it really fun to see how quickly the bike could adjust, because basically a couple of us just got bored and we looked up the entire ski slope and just pinned it up the entire mountain and never let off and just let the bike scream all the way up. And albeit you could feel a slight bit of power loss as elevation was going up, you could just feel the bike continuing to adjust and run clean all the way up and doing its best to negate the effects of altitude against the engine. So it is really cool technology. Definitely interesting to see him bring an XC. I'll be curious to see what people think of it this year in an XC style platform, because like I said initially, I'm sure the reason they've held it is the type of power. Even when they introduced the TPI before, a bunch of their professional riders in extreme enduro kind of refused to switch for a little while because of the initial batch and the way it made power they were not happy with. But with the updates, they were able to get those riders to switch over, so they're clearly happy with it now. But moving to XC, we're talking about an even more aggressive style of power. So it's definitely a stepping stone for them until they actually get to the SX models. We'll ride these at some point this year. I'm not really sure what KTM schedule is for an XC style launch or when we'll be available to ride them, but keep an eye out on this channel. Definitely will be doing a test on one, if not both bikes. Also, if you like this style of tech info, these style of just releases, just talking about the new bikes and what's coming up, make sure you hit subscribe, and thanks for watching.